July 1943, as the first light touched the Russian steppe. The vast plains near Kursk vibrated with the distant growl of engines. Gathering for an assault, unlike anything the war had yet seen. German commanders believed their armored spearheads could crush the Soviet lines in one swift motion, ending the Eastern Front. But the Red Army had transformed the land into a fortress of trenches, minefields, and anti-tank belts stretching beyond sight. Each section prepared for the storm now creeping toward them. At 4:30 a.m., the stillness shattered as German artillery streaked across the sky, lighting the horizon with violent bursts that tore into Soviet forward positions. The ground heaved under the blasts, dust rolling through the trenches like waves. Soviet gunners scrambled to their stations, hauling ammunition crates while orders echoed through the smoke. They knew this barrage marked only the beginning, and the armored weight behind it was still approaching with terrifying certainty. Through the haze, the first silhouettes of German tanks emerged, Panthers and Tigers advancing in tight wedges across the open fields, their armor gleaming despite the dust. Soviet crews steadied their nerves, adjusting range sights, fingers trembling over triggers. When the tanks finally breached full visibility, a Soviet lieutenant whispered a prayer before giving the order to fire. In an instant, quiet tension erupted into a deafening cascade of muzzle flashes and burning steel. Anti-tank guns roared, sending armor-piercing rounds screaming across the fields. But many shots bounced harmlessly off the thick plating of the Tigers pressing forward. Luftwaffe Stukas dove from above, sirens wailing as they dropped bombs that tore massive craters into the Soviet defenses. The battlefield's sound fused into an overwhelming roar, mechanical, explosive, and relentless, turning the once open steppe into a storm of fire, debris, and desperate resistance, hidden among dugouts and camouflage nets. Soviet engineers watched as the German assault drove into the first belts of mines they had spent weeks planting. One by one, explosions erupted beneath the advancing armor, tracks snapping, engines bursting into flame. Yet the German columns surged ahead, determined to force a breakthrough before Soviet reserves could counter. Smoke thickened into a suffocating curtain, and the horizon dissolved in fire-lit dust. Asterisk on the Soviet right flank. The 29th Tank Corps ignited their T-34 engines, coughing smoke into the dawn air as commanders shouted final coordinates. The massive formation surged forward, treads tearing through wheat fields flattened by artillery. Dust swallowed the tanks instantly, turning the entire line into moving shadows. Gunners slammed shells into breaches while radio operators struggled to hear through static. The countercharge became a thunderous wall of steel, pushing straight into the German advance. When the two armored waves finally collided, the battlefield dissolved into chaos. T-34s slashed across German flanks, firing on the move as Tigers responded with punishing accuracy. Turrets erupted, tracks snapped apart, and tank crews bailed from hatches into landscapes already burning around them. Soviet drivers rammed enemy armor head-on, sacrificing their machines to stall the advance. Flames reflected across helmets, giving every soldier the look of men fighting inside a living furnace above the carnage. The skies turned into a second battlefield. Soviet Yak fighters plunged into formations of Stukas, attempting another dive-bombing run. Machine guns spitting bright arcs across the clouds. Parachutes appeared like drifting ghosts as pilots abandoned crippled aircraft, floating into a world where survival was far from guaranteed. Smoke trails twisted through the air like black scars. The roar of engines and explosions merged, creating a terrifying symphony echoing for miles. By midday, visibility collapsed under dust storms, churned up by thousands of tank treads. Commanders could no longer rely on radio transmissions drowned by static and interference. Soldiers shouted orders through cloth masks, blackened with soot, as shells detonated only meters away. The sun vanished behind a curtain of drifting soil and burning fuel. Men fired at shapes rather than targets, each explosion ripping new wounds into a battlefield already unrecognizable from dawn. At Prokhorovka's outskirts, German armored units pushed toward a cluster of farmhouses. Using barns and stone walls as cover against Soviet artillery, Soviet infantry fought from shattered windows and collapsed basements, trading fire with units advancing yard by yard through smoke-filled lanes. Grenades rolled across wooden floors. Roofs collapsed from sustained shelling. Civilians huddled in cellars as their homes disintegrated above them. The entire village transforming into a maze of rubble, fire, and desperate resistance. Soviet reinforcements pushed into the line in staggered waves. Artillery crews setting up behind freshly blasted tree lines as they hammered the German advance. Shell bursts snapped trunks in half, sending shards of wood spinning through the air like shrapnel. German officers tried reorganizing their armor into tighter spearheads, but every ridge they aimed for was already fortified with overlapping fire zones. The land itself became a trap, funneling them deeper into a battlefield designed to bleed momentum away. Tank riders clung to the sides of T-34s as they thundered across open ground, bullets slicing through canvas satchels and ricocheting off metal plating. When the tanks closed in, Soviet infantry leaped off, sprinting through haze and debris to engage flanking German units. Grenades burst among scattered rifle teams. The clash became intensely personal, soldiers fighting across shell craters, hedgerows, and burning fields, each group pushing forward by instinct more than command. One Tiger tank found itself isolated after a mine. Blast crippled a neighboring vehicle. Immediately, a swarm of T-34s circled it at full speed, firing and rotating volleys. Sparks erupted across its armor as the Tiger attempted to pivot its turret, but the Soviets kept up relentless pressure. Finally, a well-placed shot struck the rear engine plate. Flames erupted violently, forcing the German crew to abandon the tank and stumble into a battlefield that offered no safe retreat. Inside a reinforced dugout, Soviet officers hunched over cluttered maps marked with frantic annotations. Reports arrived faster than they could be processed in E-armor, penetrating one flank. Fresh Soviet divisions holding another. Dust drifted from the ceiling with each nearby explosion. The commanders exchanged grim looks, understanding that the day's outcome hinged not on strategy alone, but on whether their exhausted soldiers could endure one more crushing assault. On the forward lines, a Soviet medic crawled through smoke and debris, dragging wounded soldiers by their collars toward a shallow trench barely deep enough to protect them. Bullets cracked overhead like snapping branches. His bandages were soaked, his supplies nearly gone, yet he pressed on, gripping the next injured man with trembling arms. Around him, the battlefield's roar never dimmed, each explosion shaking dirt loose from the trench walls as he fought, desperately to keep men alive. German infantry advanced in disciplined formations behind their tanks, stepping over scorched earth, littered with shell casings and broken equipment. Soviet machine gun nests, hidden among tall grass, erupted with sudden fire, tearing into the advancing line. German soldiers dove behind churned soil and wrecked vehicles, returning fire as mortar lobbed shells overhead. Smoke spread across the field, so thick that soldiers wiped their faces just to breathe and fired at moving shadows rather than confirmed targets. A Soviet anti-tank squad moved swiftly to intercept a Panther climbing over a broken hedgerow. They slid into position, braced the long PTRD rifle, and fired a single desperate shot. The round punched through a vulnerable joint near the rear and ignited the fuel lines. Flames shot out from the turret as the Panther halted abruptly, its crew scrambling out. The squad immediately shifted positions, knowing that staying still, even a moment longer, meant certain death. Realizing time was slipping away, German commanders ordered a concentrated push toward Prokhorovka, hoping momentum could finally crack Soviet defenses. Tanks surged ahead in a dense wedge, artillery thundering behind them. Soviet lines braced for impact, tightening formations and redistributing ammunition across trenches. The air vibrated with the approach of engines, the ground trembling under synchronized treads. Both sides understood that this charge would define the entire Kursk offensive. The opposing forces clashed with devastating force. Tanks rammed each other at close range, metal grinding as turrets locked in point-blank duels. Soldiers fought with pistols, knives, even shovels when ammunition ran low. Fire rolled upward in towering columns as fuel tanks detonated. Screams, orders, and explosions merged into a single, overwhelming roar. No man could distinguish friend from foe in the swirling dust and smoke that swallowed the battlefield whole as dusk crept over the burning plains. The echoes of the last German assault faded. Wrecked tanks lay scattered like broken giants across fields scorched black. The Soviet line, battered but unbroken, still held firm. Commanders surveyed the horizon through smoke and drifting embers. Understanding that the decisive thrust of Operation Citadel had failed, the great gamble for domination of the Eastern Front ended not with triumph, but with a grinding stalemate carved into the iron fields of Kursk. Nightfall offered no pause. German artillery resumed pounding Soviet defenses, shells shrieking overhead before slamming into trenches and anti-tank positions. Flames from wrecked vehicles lit the fields like torches, casting long shadows over shattered earth. Soviet rifle battalions rotated forward under constant bombardment, stumbling through smoke that sealed the horizon. Officers shouted course corrections as machine gun nests repositioned to cover gaps carved by the day's fighting. Determined to hold the line until dawn, German armored reserves entered the battlefield under cover of darkness. Dozens of Panthers and assault guns rolling forward with coordinated precision. Their headlights flicked in brief flashes through the drifting smoke, illuminating churned soil stacked with wreckage. Soviet listening posts called out engine signatures, triggering fresh waves of artillery that hammered the incoming columns. The new arrivals pressed ahead, accepting casualties to tighten pressure. Before Soviet reinforcements could fully reorganize for another counterstrike, Soviet Katyusha batteries fired a massive rocket barrage that ripped open the night sky with streaking trails of fire, pounding advancing formations. Explosions rolled across the plain like rolling thunder, shredding infantry that moved alongside the armor. German crews dropped into urgency, clambering to seal hatches while vehicles rocked violently under near impacts. Flames climbed skyward as fuel trucks detonated, casting sheets of light over blackened terrain. The battle transformed into a furnace, consuming everything exposed at first light. The battlefield roared again with the advance of Soviet tank brigades pushing to regain ground lost overnight. T-34s surged forward in tight formations, guns firing continuously as smoke belched from exhaust pipes. Tracks chewed through wreckage and churned mud into clouds that blinded both armies. German anti-tank cannons opened up, shells slamming into advancing armor. Dozens of tanks erupted simultaneously, sending burning fragments spiraling through the air. Infantry charged behind the armored assault, diving into fresh craters for cover as MG-42 fire-stitched violent arcs across their path. Mortar rounds burst overhead, spraying shrapnel in deadly patterns. Medics crawled under fire, dragging survivors out of exposed ground while officers blew whistles, signaling another push. The landscape trembled under perpetual impacts, every explosion rearranging the shape of the battlefield. Still, soldiers climbed from the smoke and pressed forward into killing zones. German assault guns attempted a counterpunch, rotating cannons to blast Soviet tank columns from long range. Monster-sized muzzle flashes lit the fields as high-velocity shells blasted through steel hulls, tearing turrets from frames. Soviet crews abandoned crippled machines and continued on foot, advancing through waves of debris and fire. Dirt rained from the sky with every hit, burying rifles and helmets in the churned ground. No position stayed safe for more than seconds. Soviet bombers arrived overhead, diving low through anti-aircraft bursts that stitched the sky with black puffs. Bombs tumbled downward, detonating among packed armored units, flipping vehicles and gouging trenches deeper. German pilots scrambled to intercept, dogfights erupting directly above frontline trenches. Burning planes spiraled downward, trailing smoke like falling comets that smashed into both sides indiscriminately, sending fire and torn metal flying across lines. Already mangled beyond recognition, German armored spearheads regrouped and drove directly into Soviet lines in a last-ditch attempt to seize control. Tigers led the charge, crushing wreckage beneath their tracks as they fired into T-34 formations at point-blank distances. Soviet tank commanders called for ramming maneuvers, engines screaming as steel slammed steel. The collisions shook the earth, sparks flying in sheets. Crews fought from open hatches with pistols and grenades when turrets jammed under non-stop pounding across the northern flank. Soviet infantry stormed German trench networks, tossing grenades over berms and firing rifles into smoke-choked corridors. Flamethrower operators advanced, streams of fire clearing dugouts with terrifying intensity. German defenders responded with close-quarters bursts, shells exploding at ground level, scattering bodies in dirt and violent fountains. The fighting devolved into primal survival where bayonets and rifle stocks replaced strategy, even as positions changed hands repeatedly. Artillery remained relentless. Entire batteries fired until barrels glowed red and buckled from strain. Shells slammed into both front lines, annihilating trenches minutes after they were captured. The ground rippled like liquid beneath the concussions, and collapsing earth swallowed soldiers alive. Neither army signaled retreat. Commands pushed forward through radio static drowned beneath the constant thunder. The battlefield became an unbroken wall of smoke and flame stretching miles across the steppe. Burning fuel raged beneath shattered armor, turning soil into molten streams. Soldiers staggered through the chaos with clothing smoldering, faces smeared with blood and soot. Machine gun teams swapped barrels glowing orange from continuous fire, hands blistered through gloves. Ammunition carriers sprinted under fire, collapsing after deliveries that lasted seconds. Jet black clouds from burning tank depots blotted out the sun, turning midday into twilight. Artificial night cloaked entire divisions, forcing both sides to rely on muzzle flashes and instinct. Spotlights cut through smoke in sweeping arcs, revealing silhouettes locked in combat. Mines detonated beneath advancing boots, throwing bodies airborne. The air tasted of oil, metal, and ash. No soldier could see more than meters through the choking haze. German forces attempted. Another breakthrough using self-propelled assault guns as moving shields. Infantry clustered behind their metal bulk. Soviet anti-tank rifles and satchel charges targeted weak points. Soldiers rushing forward with reckless resolve. Explosions blasted teams apart, but survivors pressed onward, slamming charges beneath hulls. Fireballs rolled outward, engulfing everything nearby. The advance dissolved into burning fragments across the churned earth. Soviet cavalry. Elements galloped into collapsing German lines, sabers flashing between flaming wreckage and falling debris. Horses screamed as artillery tore into open ground, yet riders pressed forward, striking through confusion to disrupt command centers. German radio trucks burst into flame as fuel ignited, cutting communication entirely. Field officers attempted hand signals across shattered terrain, but blowing smoke devoured visibility, scattering coordinated defense into isolated pockets of resistance. Armored reinforcements unleashed another massive Soviet push, tank brigades forming a steel tidal wave cresting over the ridgelines. Cannons fired non-stop, lighting the valley with flickering fire. German forward observers vanished under cascading blasts, unable to redirect artillery onto the moving formations. T-34s smashed through defensive trenches, crushing fortifications and forcing infantry to dive aside. The advance accelerated, momentum turning into iron momentum impossible to slow. German command ordered a final defensive stand around a ridge lined with anti-tank guns dug into hardened positions. The air trembled beneath the concentrated barrage as T-34 holes shattered in fountains of flame. But replacement tanks filled every gap instantly. Soviet infantry sprinted through broken armor, throwing grenades into gun pits in rapid waves. The position dissolved under relentless assault. Firelight reflecting off steel helmets and broken earth. The battlefield transformed into a hurricane of metal, fire, and collapsing structure. Machine gun nests spit continuous streams as artillery turned ground into boiling soil. Tank crews fired blindly through smoke, reloading by muscle memory. Men advanced with uniforms half burned away, stepping over wrecks still burning hot enough to warp steel. The thunder merged into one uninterrupted roar, shaking the horizon. German formations, now reduced to fragments, attempted a final withdrawal to avoid encirclement. Rearguards fired desperately to slow the Soviet pursuit. Soviet batteries, silent for hours due to repositioning, opened simultaneously. Saturating retreat routes with wall-to-wall fire, columns collapsed under the barrage, vehicles flipping and airborne debris turning retreat into slaughter. Flames leapt skyward as ammunition trailers erupted into towering infernos visible for miles. Soviet armor swarmed through collapsing defenses. Cannons hammering fleeing positions. Fighter aircraft swooped overhead, strafing with precise bursts that stitched blazing trails across convoys, scattering down narrow roads. Columns of smoke twisted upward in monstrous shapes as fuel stores erupted. The sound grew beyond scale. Earthquake and hurricane fused together. Survival replaced tactics as soldiers ran without formation. By nightfall, the field lay buried beneath a landscape of molten wreckage and cratered soil. Fires raged unchecked across miles of shattered steppe, flames painting the sky red. The thunder finally waned into a broken hush, placed by the crackle of burning steel and the groans of survivors trapped beneath collapsed hulls. The Battle of Kursk ended not with surrender or speech, but with annihilation carved into the land, a turning point forged in fire and iron.